You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Michelle Cox.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show coming up for you. As always, go to hankgarner.com where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, YouTube. Anywhere that you like to get your author interviews, you can find us there. I'd like to thank Aaron St. Pierre and Gwen White today for sponsoring this episode with their book, The Fire Thief. She fights to survive, but only white-hot rage will reveal her true power. Remembering the hope of the past helps Stasha endure her bleak present. Blaming herself for her best friend's injury, she brawls and steals to provide in a world run by Fae. But with an arranged marriage approaching, Stasha swipes 2 silvers in hope of their escape and erupts into a fiery burst of magic. Surprised and confused by power she can't possibly control, Stasha barely has time to register that her friend has been sent off to die. With time running out and no options left, she must put her faith in powerful strangers as they dive into a Fae skirmish for supremacy. Surrounded by dubious allies, her only hope to redeem her past is to mount an attack on an inescapable death camp. As Stasha fights to free her friend, the battle she's faced her whole life is about to become a war. The Fire Thief is the first book in an exhilarating high fantasy series. If you like gutsy heroines, elemental magic, and epic sword and sorcery action, then you'll love New York Times bestselling authors Aaron St. Pierre and Gwen White's roller coaster tale. Buy The Fire Thief to unlock an ancient Fae destiny today. Also thanks to Patrice Fitzgerald and the Beyond the Stars Space Opera Anthology series. There are 5 volumes out, and a 6th one comes out this summer in the Beyond the Stars Space Opera Anthology series. Each release includes between 10 and 15 short stories, followed by a Q&A with the author. Some of the writers are New York Times and USA Today bestsellers. Some readers are saying, it's a blisteringly good collection. These stories are full of great complex characters, not all of them human. Twists and turns and fantastic world building. Epic space battles, exotic aliens, far-flung planets. 15 fabulous tales that will thrill and surprise you, some chosen from previous Beyond the Stars volumes and some brand new, are in the Best Of collection. Come along as these award-winning authors sweep you along on adventures as broad as the universe and as deep as their imagination. The Beyond the Stars Space Opera Anthology series. Pick it up today. Stay tuned after the show for a special audiobook clip from C. Stephen Manley's Master of Hounds. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Michelle Cox back on the show with me today. She was on last year talking about her book, A Promise Given, and she has a brand new book out. When you're hearing this, it's available everywhere in paperback and Kindle edition. It's called A Veil Removed, and it's the latest in the Henrietta and Inspector Howard novel series. Welcome back to the show, Michelle.
Thank you, Hank. It's fun to be back.
I'm excited to have you back. So what has been going on this past year since we chatted last time? I know you've got the new book out. How did the promotion for the last book go? And have you met some new readers along the way?
Yeah, I think the promotion went, really well. And we're always reaching out, for new promotion angles. And I do feel like my kind of fan base, if you want to call it that, is really growing. And so that's exciting too. And I think a lot of that, is maybe some of the efforts that we're putting out, but also just, I think a lot of it is really grassroots. People just telling other people, about the series, and that's so much fun to get that feedback from readers who write to me and say, my neighbor suggested you, or the librarian had a display, and that's really been very, very gratifying.
Oh, there's no better salesman than someone else who has enjoyed the book.
Yes, exactly.
That's
so we're starting
fantastic.
to see some movement there, so that's great.
I love it. I love it. Tell everyone about the book series, Henrietta and Inspector Howard. Who are these characters? We're going to put a link to last year's show in where people can go listen to that one as well. But just bring new listeners up to speed on who these characters are and how this book series came to be.
Okay, great. The series is historical fiction. Sort of mystery romance, it's a little bit of everything, which is either a good thing or a bad, depending on what you like to read. But it's set in the 30s in Chicago. I like to call it a little Downton Abbey meets upstairs, downstairs with a mystery thrown in. And I think that's a pretty accurate description. The premise is that Henrietta is a very young woman. She's this bombshell in the 30s, and actually she was based on her character is based on a real woman that I met in a nursing home. And she was apparently this bombshell in Chicago. She had all these amazing adventures, and so I took a lot of her life story and crafted the character of Henrietta from her, and then I invented this, the inspector and a murder and that whole thing, and then the whole series was born. But the book is about this young woman who is working as a taxi dancer in Chicago, and she her dance floor matron is murdered, and so the inspector, Clive Howard, appears on the scene, and he quickly decides to take advantage of her beauty and has her go undercover for him as an usherette in a burlesque house because he thinks that the murders are connected. And so it kind of goes from there, and then each book builds on the next and the next and the next. So it's kind of a little bit of a different mystery series. I mean, there are some mystery series which are great in that it's just the same stock characters every time and they just solve a different mystery. But that's not really what this series is. It's more saga. It's more the character arcs just keep going and all the subplots keep running along the whole series. So some people read them out of order. I don't advise doing that. I mean, some people say it's fine, but it's just so much more gratifying if you start from the beginning because you see these characters when they first meet, and then by book 4, a million things have happened. So
right,
that's it in a nutshell.
I love the setting of these books and the time period, which I count as part of setting as well. The 1930s, and especially this window that you're writing in is and I think we talked a little bit about this last time, that it's really interesting because it's between world wars. The world is changing just immensely during this time period, and we think of after World War II as really the beginning of this modern era that we live in, and before that it was a completely different world. And you mentioned Downton Abbey and upstairs downstairs, that if you've watched Downton Abbey, you see the immense changes that happen in society during that time, and how the world's completely changing. What was it about this time period that drew you to want to write more in this window of time?
Well, I think, to be really, really honest, I have, or started out with more of an affinity for the 40s and World War II and that whole setting. But because I was basing the character of Henrietta on this woman that I met, her whole story, her whole, string of jobs and adventures really were happening during the 30s. So her trials were, about the Great Depression and not having a hard time getting a job, keeping a job, all of that kind of stuff. And I thought, her one detail that she told me that I just couldn't let go of was the fact that she worked at the 1933 World's Fair as a Dutch girl. She had to dress up in a Dutch girl costume every day. and hand out these flyers. And I loved that detail so much. And at the time, I didn't realize this was going to be a series. I was just writing a one-off. So I'm like, I'll just set this book in the 30s. I just have to do it that way. And then it ended up turning into a series, and I'm like, oh my gosh, now I've got to write this series in the 30s. But I had learned so much by that point, and I can draw on a lot of stories from my own family who went through a lot during the Depression. And I thought, what, this is actually kind of neat because, there's a glut of World War II literature out there. And even, there's starting to be a lot centered around World War I, but there's not as much set between those two. It's kind of like a lost decade. It's set, between those two wars. And I thought, this is kind of neat. This is something different, hopefully. And you can talk a lot about, the disillusionment of after the First World War, and people thought it was the end, war to end all wars, and then you have all of this, political tension rising again. So it's a neat era to write about the haves and the have-nots. There's plenty of material, and I, really, really jumped right into it and fully absorbed it.
Well, it's definitely fertile ground. Like you said, there are so many books about World War II right now, and thank God for it, because I think we need those stories to help us remember and to not have those things lost to history. And World War I is definitely coming in vogue again to tell stories there. But when you're focusing on the overlooked period in a lot of ways, where do you go to do your historical research to look for those things that really immerse us as readers into this time period and to help us remember this time period?
Well, like I said, I have a lot of stories from my own family of getting through the Depression. Also, as I worked at the nursing home on the northwest side of Chicago, and those residents had not millions, but thousands of stories about life during that time. So I do think that a lot of my, quote, research is really sort of first person, just gathering so many stories from them. Also, I did go on there's a website called the History or Encyclopedia of Chicago, and that has a ton of information. And also, I just went into the specific neighborhoods that I'm writing about. Many of them have their own historical societies, and some are better than others, but a lot of them actually do have first-person accounts or very rich history that you can read, and I was able to get a lot of information from that as well.
I love the idea of gathering stories, and as storytellers ourselves, that's really what we're doing. We're collecting these experiences of people and finding new ways to tell them, and that's one of the best parts of being a writer, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I love it. It's being able to share these stories with a broader audience, and in a way, I feel like it's honoring those people because their story is not lost to history forever. Exactly.
One of the other things that I really love about this series is that the combination of Henrietta and the inspector is they make for such a great team because he's this stuffy by the rules Inspector Howard, and then she is the epitome of the everyman character, and you get this great tension between them, but it brings a character to the story quite unlike any other kind of mystery thriller series out there. How fun is it writing these characters, and do you find yourself head hopping between Henrietta and Inspector Howard as you're writing?
Yeah, thanks for that. I love them too. And I do think that they have a great chemistry. And I do try to switch the perspective periodically through the books. Sometimes the reader is in Clive's head and sometimes in Henrietta. And I just think it's kind of a neat twist on the whole Cinderella story. Because, she gets swept up into, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler because you could read this on the back of the books. He's revealed to actually be from a very wealthy family, which is where the whole have and have not, dynamic comes in. And she's swept up into this world and she doesn't really want to be necessarily. So it's kind of like she doesn't want to be walled up in the castle. She wants to be out and she really wants to be not his equal, but sort of, which is kind of unusual for that time. And it's very, as the books go along, I have to try to keep that dynamic going. And as I said before, there's a lot of subplots and a lot of characters coming on board. And, it's harder to write the new characters because they're new to you and you have to flesh them out. So then when I'm writing a scene where it's Clive and Henrietta, it's like, oh, it's so much easier because I know them so well. I know exactly what they're going to say and do. So it's like they're friends.
Yeah. Well, after finishing your fourth book, which is out now, how have these characters grown for you from that first story where you're just discovering them and you're putting them together and, there's this kind of odd tension between them, to now, sort of partners and, they've been on several adventures together. How do you keep finding fresh things to put them into?
Well, that's a good question. I try to come up with what would logically happen next for them. And I try to also, like by book 5, Elsie, the younger sister, has, really come into her own. She started out as being just, the little sister. And now by book 5, she has almost like in 4 and 5, she has like almost an equal role in the novel. And so it's very fun and also very fertile, as you said, to weave those two storylines. So by book 5, one of the adventures is they're helping Elsie out of, a scrape that she has found herself in. So yeah, they have very much changed, and not only through the adventures that they've experienced, but different things that have come along by deaths that have occurred or secrets that have been revealed, and that each step or each thing that occurs, just like in real life, it really solidifies them as a couple. It poses a lot of challenges, but it also is a way for them to grow. And so now if I go back to book 1 and read their characters, it's almost like I blush at how new they are to each other and how unsure, and it's like peeking in at the beginning of someone's relationship, and now they are so much further down the road, so much closer, and can almost predict what the other is going to say or do, and that's fun too.
Nice. Of the two characters, Henrietta and Clive, is one character more difficult for you to keep moving forward? Does one unfold in their character evolution more naturally than the other?
That's a really good question. It's probably easier to write Henrietta because she's a woman. It's a little harder to write Clive, and harder to get into his mindset because a lot of what he is, a lot of what makes him who he is his background as the heir to this huge fortune, the fact that he was a captain in World War I, and we find out as the books go on that he's suffering a little bit from PTSD, and So it's a little harder because I'm not a man and haven't gone through all of that to write him, and also to just write what his mindset would have been in the 30s. I mean, obviously I wasn't in the 30s and I wasn't a woman then either, but I do feel like I can relate more to possibly what Henrietta is feeling. There's obviously more of me in her than there would be in Clive, so it's easier to be in her mind.
Sure. You live in Chicago, right?
Yeah, northern suburbs.
Gotcha. Is there ever a temptation to move them out of Chicago and explore some new place, or are these always going to be very Chicago stories?
Well, book one is only in Chicago. Book two, because his family estate is in the northern suburbs, so a lot of the book unfolds there too. Book three, half of the book takes place in England, and that was really super fun to write. And because my husband's from England, and I studied there for a long time, so that kind of felt fun to me to bring that into the story. Yeah, so 4 and 5 are just, again, go back between, those two locales, but I think book 6, they might venture off to a new locale, so that would be fun too. But the books are always, they're always tied back to Chicago, though, because all of the other subplots that are going on. So Clive and Henrietta, might be off in England, doing whatever, but then the book's always going back to the other characters who are, stuck in Chicago or Winnetka or whatever. So there's always a link.
Well, and what a rich place and time to be writing in. So much was happening. You could write 100 stories there and probably never scratch all the possibilities.
No, that's just it. I mean, you could go on forever. There's, an infinite supply of stories. And also, I think what would be fun is if I would love to do some spin-off series. So you could take some of the characters and, have them in a certain location and do their own thing and, kind of cross-reference. I love series like that, and so I would love to be able to do that at some point.
That would be a lot of fun. Michelle, how has your writing process changed in writing these books?
That's a good question. Time-wise, I would say because I have all these books out now, it's a lot of my day, most of my day is spent with marketing and promotion. So maybe only an hour, maybe an hour or two is spent on actually working on writing or editing whatever manuscript I'm on at that time. And that's something that, wasn't there at the beginning, that it was just about the writing. And now it's about, selling the books and promoting them and all of that sort of thing. So that's one difference. I would think the second difference is that I learned through trial and error. The first book, was like my little pet, and it would go with me everywhere. And I would edit while I was at, my kids were at swimming lessons, or I would edit, during halftime at one of their basketball games or wherever. And I know now that that's disastrous, that I just can't. My mind has to be crystal clear, even to edit, probably even more so to edit. And it has to be the first thing in the morning when my mind is super crisp, not like when I'm in. I used to try to edit in bed at night, and I would be, turning page after page, like, wow, this is really good. There's no mistakes. Obviously, because I'm really tired. So right. I had to learn, that there's a time and a place.
Well, I've learned that that ideas come to me at the most random times, and and I can jot those down like in my phone or in a notebook or something so I don't lose them. But I'm kind of like you. Even though I may get an idea, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the proper place to whip out the laptop and flesh that out. Write down those ideas so you don't forget them, but then go to your quiet place and really work on those. So I know people that can just open up the laptop and just write for 15 minutes, and it's amazing. And then they just do that at random places. And but yeah, I'm like you. I need that spot. And it's not that I hold it precious to the point that, I can only write if it's, this very specific place and time and all that. But there is a time and place for it. And giving yourself a little peace and quiet and focus really makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does for me. And like you're saying, some people I know writers who can't write unless music is playing, or they can't write unless they're in a coffee shop. There's no way that would work for me, but I guess it's just finding what works for you. Right.
Exactly. How about the planning and or plotting of your books? Has that changed in the writing? Do you are you more or less of a planner than you were when you began?
No, I'm pretty much a plotter. So I do come up with a pretty extensive outline before I begin, and I think I've probably gotten better at it as time has gone on, just from experience. And I usually just write out all the plot lines, and then all the points, all the plot points that each plot line has to achieve, and then I work on how to weave those together. And I guess even writing just a short, maybe one-line chapter, like what this chapter is supposed to achieve, and then what the next and the next, so that when you sit down to write, you kind of know where this is going to go, or what this chapter has to accomplish. But I've also learned that it's okay to change. It's okay for the story to veer in a slightly different direction than you originally thought it was going to, and just give yourself that permission.
That was going to be my next question. Do the characters ever get away from you and do their own thing in the midst of it?
Yeah. Those pesky characters. And I used to hate that when, before I was writing myself, you would hear others say, oh, the characters took over. And I'm like, oh, okay, right. But really, sometimes that does happen. I mean, Elsie is the prime example in the whole book, the whole series. She was never meant to be a primary character. And I was always trying to write her in a certain way, and it just wasn't working. And so I finally just had to let her be the person that she wanted to be.
Oh man, those pesky characters. The new book, what do we find these characters up to in book 4?
In book 4, it's hard sometimes because I'm a book ahead, and I have to be careful not to give anything away. So what happens in 4? Okay, so at the end of 3, they get a call or a telegram while they're in England on their honeymoon that Clive's father has passed away. So there's little hints at the end that Clive is just not sitting well with him. And so when they come back, which is the beginning of 4, he's convinced that this was not an accident. He feels like something happened to his father. So part of the book is about them sort of, his mother thinks that he's, gone a little crazy, and first Henrietta does too. And then she becomes convinced too that there was something going on, and they discover a lot of secrets that Clive's father was keeping from everybody. So they're sort of investigating that. And then meanwhile, Elsie, who was about to elope with a very naughty man, we find out, on the first page, so I'm not really ruining too much, that fell through, and for various reasons, too long to go into. And so she begins taking classes at this women's college in Chicago, run by nuns, which is actually my alma mater. So that was fun to write. So she starts taking classes there, and then she's still not free from her grandfather's schemes of trying to marry her off to somebody who will increase the family coffers. And she's always trying to fight them, and she finally, sort of to get away from this pressure, she decides that she wants to, or she tells everybody that she wants to become a nun, which is one of the reference to the veil in the title. Is this? She sees this as a way to, to kind of get away from everybody, to get them to leave her alone. So you got these two storylines running, and it all, gets twisty-turny. But it's a great story.
That's one thing I love about your books. Your titles always have these hidden meanings and these multiple meanings and layers of meaning. And I love that you did that in this one. We've got the wedding veil. We've got, a funeral veil. We've got, the other storyline with the nuns. And there's just so many. The more you read and the more you get into it, more unfolds. And you're like, it's almost like Michelle was giving me hints along the way. And I love it. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah, I do try to give little hints.
I love it. So you referenced book 5. I'm assuming that you are writing or have recently finished 5.
Yeah, I'm trying to desperately finish my own, personal edits before I hand it over to them. We are right in the midst of picking the cover, so that's always very stressful. But I'm grateful that I get, a say in that. So that's, pretty rare. So that's really nice, but, nail biting. You just want to pick the right one. So yeah, we are in full throttle with that one. Excellent.
Well, the new book is called A Veil Removed. It is the Henrietta and Inspector Howard novel series, book number 4. It's an excellent read. We're encouraging everyone to go pick up their copy of it. Michelle, where can people find you online if they want to dig into your back catalog and follow along with what's going on?
Great. Yeah. MichelleCoxWrites.com. And then there's lots of links to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Also, I'd encourage you to sign up for my newsletter because I have almost every month big contests for just my subscribers only. So the past 2 contests, I've given away a whole set of books and a tablet and gift cards, and I usually put together big extravaganza packages. So sign up for my newsletter.
Nice. We'll put a link to it in the show notes and encourage everybody to do that. Michelle, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's always fun talking with you and catching up, and we wish you much success on the book launch.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the show. Go to hankgarner.com to subscribe. Now stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Master of Hounds from C. Stephen Manley.
He met Clint's eyes for the first time, and for an instant they flared with a dark violet light, like something you'd see lighting up fluorescent paints in a nightclub. Clint gasped suddenly despite himself and took another few steps back. He turned to run, blood bags scraping along behind him, when a chorus of howls from the floors below brought him up short. He stopped and looked around, fighting hard to keep his fear under control. "Be glad you parked near the top," the man said. "I told my hounds to start at the bottom and work their way up, while I came in from above. If you'd encountered them instead of me, you'd be in pieces by now." Clint was sure he could make it to either the stairwell that would lead him back inside or the elevator that would take him down to the garage's ground level. He'd have to stop at either, though, whether to try and pull a door open or wait for the elevator car. He glanced to the side as flashes of police strobes started lighting up the night beyond the parking deck, and sirens grew louder. He heard the distant chop-chop of a helicopter's rotors. "Don't get your hopes up," the man said. "All the pickmen are dead, and my hounds will make short work of the police. You're trapped, son. Face it like a man." Clint thought it over for a second before he realized that the man was right. No matter which way he went, he would get run down before he had a chance to get clear. There was no way out, and that meant there was only one thing left to do. He drew in a deep breath, knelt, and placed the patient on the floor as gently as he could. Fear-driven breath hissed around his teeth as he turned and faced the man in the stained suit. "I'm not your son," he said, meeting the other's eyes and planting his feet. The man's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Excuse me?" Clint swallowed hard. "You heard me, Slim. I'm not your son, and if you're looking to hurt this guy, well, we have a problem if that's the case." The man's eyes had grown wide with disbelief as Clint had been talking. After a moment, a wide smile crossed his face. "Let me make sure I understand," he said, holding up a hand for Clint to wait. "You've met my hounds. You just saw me throw that female around like she was a lawn dart, and now you're standing between me and my prey, even though it's obvious from your face that you have no earthly idea what I am or what you're actually facing. Have I got that all right?" Clint swallowed again. His mouth was as dry as a desert wind. "I think that about sums it up." The dark light flared through the man's eyes again, and tiny arcs of the same colored electricity danced over his hands. "Give me the pickman," the man said, his voice suddenly more animal than man. Clint's stomach tightened as his guts went cold. For just an instant he almost ran, but the moment passed, and he shifted his hands and feet into a defensive stance. He forced himself to hold the other man's black-light stare as he shook his head. Suddenly the lights were gone from the man's eyes as though they'd never been there. "Really?" he said. "Usually that little display sends you humans running like rabbits. It's been decades since anyone stood up to me like this. Why would you? You must recognize that I can kill you as easy as sliding off a horse. Why would you risk that for someone you've just met? He can't possibly be anything to you." "He's my patient," Clint said, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. "He's mine to look after until he's well. That, and I made a promise. Besides, you said it yourself. I'm boxed in here. If this is where I go out, then I'm sure as hell not going to do it running." The man studied Clint through narrowed eyes, his smile dropping into a thoughtful line. "You would die for a promise. Son, that makes you a rarity in today's world." He raised a finger to his lips absently, as though considering his options, and then said, "I'll tell you what. Since you've shown some obvious courage, I'll make you a deal. You walk away unmolested by either myself or my hounds. Gone, free and clear to live out as long a life as you can manage. Only you, though. The pickman stays with me." Even Clint was surprised by how fast he replied. "No deal, freak show. This man's under my protection." The man with the black-light eyes shook his head thoughtfully. "A rarity indeed," he said. "It's very nearly a shame to kill you." The man studied him a moment longer, then shrugged and said, "Oh well, omelets and eggs." Energy flared around his hands, and he thrust them toward Clint. Clint saw the hands coming up, the dark energy crackling between them. At the same time, though, he felt someone grab his ankle from behind. Warmth, like walking from a cold room into a hot summer day, flooded through him. At the same moment, searing pain seemed to light up his chest and head. For an instant, everything went dark. He felt as though he were being shredded apart from the inside out and pulled into a trillion molecule-sized lines that stretched out into a black forever. He had no throat to scream with, or eyes to weep with, or limbs to defend himself with. For that instant he was little more than a stain of pain and terror stretched across the world. Then the instant was over. Clint didn't feel himself fall, didn't feel the concrete bite into his face, didn't hear the sobbing scream that rushed from his throat. In those last instants before the darkness came for him again and his vision was clear, all he saw was his patient rising to his feet and stepping past him.